Good morning, my name is Gerard Seitz. I'm a professor of organizational behavior at the Richard Ivey School of Business. I'm also the executive director of the E&O Innotovich Institute for Leadership. And I'm very pleased to have with me this morning Daniel Diermeier from Northwestern University, who will be here this morning as part of the Ivey Idea Forum to talk about his book, Reputation Rules. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Daniel, a couple of short questions. In your book, you introduced the concept of the trust radar. You talk about 4 key concepts that are foundational to building and maintaining trust. Transparency, empathy, commitment, and expertise. Can you elaborate a little bit on these 4 kind of foundational aspects of building trust?
Absolutely. These 4 factors really play a major role whenever we have a reputational crisis or a situation when the reputation of the company is really on the line. And these 4 factors are really derived from the research on how you maintain trust in situations where trust is under threat. And what has been demonstrated is that, particularly in those situations where people are highly emotionally fearful and so forth, these 4 factors have had a major impact in maintaining and even improving trust with respect to individuals and organizations.
Okay. If I think about one of those elements, transparency, it occurs to me, Daniel, that it's a nice word to use, but society doesn't always reward transparency or accountability. And so, what advice would you have for leaders to truly live it effectively, right? Transparency.
So all 4 of these concepts sound pretty obvious when you hear them for the first time, but every one of them is associated with trapdoors and potential pitfalls, and that's true of transparency too. So when people think about transparency, they often confuse it with full disclosure, but these are very different concepts. You want to think about transparency really as a concept that is audience specific. So that means what's transparent to an investor may not be transparent to a customer and vice versa. The key to transparency is to think from the other side's point of view and to make sure that you understood. And if you're not understood, then people immediately infer or believe that you're trying to obfuscate the issue. So it requires a lot more work to have transparency as part of your repertoire and to live it actively than it seems at first sight.
Mm-hmm. What about the concept of empathy, for example? I think sometimes people try to fake it. And so kind of the same question, how would you truly live empathy? And perhaps you can talk a little bit about what would be kind of a good apology.
Yes, great question. And again, the issue there has to do with authenticity that you pointed out. So I think that the tension that managers or leaders or CEOs get kind of stuck in is this tension between empathy and apology. And people sometimes say, well, I don't want to apologize because I've done nothing wrong, or there's legal issues and so forth. But that doesn't mean you can't have empathy. Empathy just means is that I'm connecting with the pain or the injury that you've suffered as a human being. What happens in these situations when we have reputational crisis, people look at companies, at their leaders, not as an abstract provider of goods and services, but much more like a member of the community or even like a family member. And then what do you expect from somebody when something bad happens to you? You want to see them reach out to you, even though it's not their fault. And being clear about how these mechanisms work is enormously valuable in these situations.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, you've done a large amount of research, and I was wondering, through your research, what have you identified as the 3 most common mistakes in working through a crisis? That would be the first question. The second question is, how come it is so difficult for leaders and their organizations to learn from the mistakes that others have made?
Yes. So the first thing is the typical mistakes. I think the first problem is when people hear the word crisis, they think something negative, threat. And then their immediate response is damage control or something along those lines. Now, what you have to realize is, particularly when you're a large, well-known organization, is that at the same time when you're managing the operational or safety or legal crisis, you're also managing a reputational crisis at the same time. It is as if you're on stage. And so keeping these 2 dimensions open at the same time is very difficult. The second big mistake is that there's too much focus on the details, the nitty-gritty, the technical aspect of the problem, and less on the trust side. Very often this shows up where people focus exclusively on the expertise dimension of the 4 factors of trust and try to kind of convince people that they're right and the other people are wrong. And then the third component is really the emotional impact. I think many leaders just underestimate of how difficult emotionally it is to survive survive and thrive in reputational crisis, they become defensive or feel sorry for themselves, or just become angry that they find themselves in a situation and then no longer think clinically.
Okay, and how come it's so difficult for individuals and their organizations to learn from the mistakes that others have made? Because quite frankly, we see on a daily basis almost stories in the newspapers, on television, about leaders who don't handle themselves very well.
Yes, I think that's a common human problem, is to learn from it. We have difficulty to learn from our own mistakes, but we particularly have difficulty to learn from the mistakes of others. And that is something that is extremely inefficient, of course, because what a great data set, right, to look at others. I think what happens very often is that we misunderstand or we mistake crisis as something that is rooted in the company has done something wrong, or that they don't have their act together, and of course we are different than our competitors. I think that's always there, and that is a common kind of problem or pitfall you have to guard against. My sense is, however, is that the broader topic of reputation and protecting reputation, that at least that perspective has been changing. We've had so many high-profile cases that, and I do spend quite a bit of time now with board members. The board members, they know somebody who has been in a similar situation like that. And then they look at themselves and ask themselves now more and more, if I or our organization had been in the same situation, had we done any better? And the answer is no. And that starts the thinking process in a more productive way.
I see, great. What Canadian leaders are you familiar with that you believe have done an outstanding job in working through a particular crisis or a crisis-like situation? And what was it about their approach that makes you believe they did a good job?
I think the one example that really stands out over the last few years is Maple Leaf Foods and the recall that they had. And it was, when you look through the analysis or when you look through how the leaders in this year responded, it's almost a textbook example of the 4 factors of trust. They were transparent, they were out there, the CEO was involved, was visible, there was a strong sense of empathy, and at least from what we can tell from the outside, without having details into internal details, it was something that was recognized in the Canadian public as kind of an exemplary conduct as well.
Okay, great. Final question, Daniel. In the book, you really talk about kind of organizations, organizational reputation, and so forth. But let's take a minute to look at the individual level. What can leaders do to build their own leadership brand that people would say that's a great brand to have, a great reputation, and would be particularly interested in finding out or hearing from you what advice you would have for Lance Armstrong as he is trying to move forward after his admission of using doping?
Yes, so the principles that I discuss in the book, mostly with respect to corporations, apply to other domains as well. So for example, they do apply to nonprofits, universities, charitable organizations, and so forth. And we've just had, of course, a whole bunch of examples where nonprofits had similar difficulties as corporations. They also apply to individuals. Now, it's easier and more difficult to think about it from an individual point of view. The easier aspect is that you don't have as complex an organizational structure as you would have with a multinational. The problem is, of course, when you build your personal brand or your personal brand becomes really your main business asset, well, now the personal and the business gets intertwined. And we saw this with Lance Armstrong. We also saw it dramatically with Tiger Woods, where basically personal failings really destroyed or at least significantly impacted a very powerful brand for advertisers and so forth. Now, when you look at Lance Armstrong, I think Lance Armstrong is really an example where you have to say where there's the limits of what communication can do. There are just aspects. I know he tried with Oprah and so forth. I think it was at best a mixed success. Probably may have hurt him even more. But when you have a shortcoming that's so dramatic and gets so to the core of what in this particular stand he stood for, it's very difficult to repair this, certainly not in the short term. You really have to kind of dedicate your life in some sense to fixing this particular problem. And then after many years, it may be possible to recover from that. So I think it's an example for where you see what's possible, but also where the limits are.
I see. All right. Well, thank you very much, Daniel. I enjoyed the conversation very much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks.